If you really want to know, I highly recommend watching episode 22, which you can find a link to in this video description below. With that out of the way, let's go further up and further in with part 2.
You got the touch. You got the power.
Welcome to But I Digress, where sometimes my mouth goes faster than my brain. I am your host Nathan, call me Nate Marchand, and welcome true believers to part 2 of how to write speculative fiction. This week we will be talking about the all-important story construction. Now, before we continue, I must once again give a re-endorsement to How to Write Fantasy and Science Fiction by Orson Scott Card. I will be borrowing heavily from this book in this particular episode. But, as I said before, Card goes into much more detail about the subject than I can. So I highly recommend that you read this book, particularly if you are interested in writing for this particular genre. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. Now, the bulk of this week's episode will be focused on mice.
Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist.
Again, not quite what I meant. MICE is an acronym used by Card in his book for 4 different kinds of story types. These are NuLu, idea, character, and event. Now, these story constructions are used throughout all of literature. They are not limited to speculative fiction, but I will be talking about how they are used in speculative fiction and give you examples of each one within the genre. NuLu, besides being a fancy French word, means environment or social setting. In other words, a NuLu story is one that is focused on the world in which it takes place. Such stories begin when the protagonist enters this new world, and they end when the protagonist leaves that world. But it is more than simply a story of characters exploring strange new worlds, if I may borrow the phrase. The characters are awed and changed by their experiences in this new world. Now, I can think of a couple of noteworthy examples, not the least of which being the literary classic Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. The title alone should tell you what it's about. It's about a guy named Gulliver, and he travels to strange new worlds, to weird places that no one else has ever seen. It's more or less a travelogue. You know, most famously, he travels to one world where he is a giant and everyone else is small. Now, another one, and one of my personal favorites, is Out of the Silent Planet by C.S. Lewis, the first in his space trilogy. In this one, you have Dr. Ransom, who is abducted by aliens and taken to the planet Malacandra, which Ransom then finds out is the planet Mars, and while eluding his captors, he is able to explore the planet and see just how different it is from Earth. I wish I could tell you more, but I don't want to spoil the book for you. You really should just read this and the rest of the trilogy. They are all wonderful. And now the idea story. These begin by asking a question,
Doctor Who?
or the first question if you prefer, that must be answered by the characters. And they end once that question has been answered. You see this most commonly in mystery stories, because they'll start off with a question like, say, who murdered so-and-so? And then they end once the mystery has been solved and the culprit has been caught. Now, keep in mind, when you're writing an idea story, you need to make sure that you focus on the question and not on the characters, or else you'll confuse your audience. Because they'll begin your story wanting to see that question be answered. They won't be checking out your story because they want to see a character study. So don't veer from the question to said character study. Now, there are a couple of great examples of this. Most noteworthy would be the literary classic Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Easily the most famous of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Yeah, I know, it's technically not speculative fiction, but it starts off as a supernatural mystery. The question in this one is there really a supernatural hound going around killing people? So, to answer that question, they call in the great Sherlock Holmes and his sidekick, Dr. Watson, to find out. Now, a more recent example would be the film Oblivion, starring Tom Cruise. In this one, you have a security repairman who might possibly be the last person on Earth who is living on a nearly ruined futuristic Earth, and then he meets a mysterious stranger that makes him start to question everything he knows. And then a series of events just start getting more bizarre as they go along. Now, I know a lot of critics didn't like this movie, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it if you want to see how to create a good science fiction mystery. And now on to my personal favorite, the character story. This is a story about the transformation of a character. They begin when a character becomes unhappy or angry or impatient or otherwise discontent with his current role, and they end once that character has settled into a new role or has given up the quest to do so. Now, in stories like this, the changes that the characters go through can be conscious or unconscious. Maybe the character did not intend to begin a journey where he would change. It just happens over the course of the story. Now, the great thing about this kind of story is that it can be a subplot in the other three kinds of stories that we're talking about. For example, as I mentioned with the NuLu story, one of its characteristics is that the character changes through his experiences in this new world. That's what's so great about it. Now, Card says that you don't necessarily have to have strong characterization in order to have a good story, which I don't quite agree with, but he does say, and I do agree with him on this, that if you want to have a good character story, you must, it is a requirement, you must have strong characterization, because your audience needs to connect with that character and relate to that character in order to see that the changes that the character goes through are believable. Now, a couple of examples of this would include, and these are a couple of my favorite stories I might add, is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Because in this one you have Bilbo, who is a humble hobbit, doesn't want to have anything to do with adventure, goes on an adventure and realizes that he loves adventure and he is capable of more than he originally thought. Now, this is something that this is a point I should say that I think Peter Jackson is missing with the movies, but I digress. Now, another one is one of my favorite movies of all time, that being Batman Begins. Because in this one, you have Bruce Wayne, who starts off as a vengeful, angry young man, and then is able to channel all of that and become everyone's favorite superhero, Batman. And the kinds of stories like that where you have a bad character who becomes good is something I love seeing. I love redemption stories, and given how popular this trilogy of movies was, there's obviously a huge audience for such things. And finally, we have the event story. In these sorts of stories, something is wrong with the order of the universe, and the character or characters set out to make it right. These sorts of stories end when a new order is established, the old order is restored, or in rare cases, everything spirals into chaos. And they begin when the character whose actions are most crucial to the story gets involved, and not necessarily when the order is ruined. Card argues, and I think this is a fair assessment, that this is the most common story type that you will see in speculative fiction. The cool thing about it is that this kind of story can be grand, say overthrowing an alien empire, or it can be subtle, like say someone trying to change their role in society. Now, a pitfall that you want to avoid when writing these kinds of stories is don't write lengthy prologues explaining the history and how everything came undone. Because as I said before, unless you're a talented uber writer like J.R.R. Tolkien, you're just going to bore your readers and lose their attention. Now, there are many examples that I could pull for this within speculative fiction, but I'm going to stick to two of the most famous, not the least of which is the ever-popular Star Wars. Come on, let's think about this. What is this entire trilogy of movies about? overthrowing the evil galactic empire because they ruined everything. And when does the story get started? More or less when Luke Skywalker appears on the scene. Now, another one is my all-time favorite book, Lord of the Rings. Because, I mean, Card argues that this is an event story, although I would say that there's more to it than simply being an event story, but it does fit his template in that you have the evil dark overlord Sauron reasserting his power to make his grand return, and he is trying to get his magic One Ring back, so in order to solidify his power, and now everyone in Middle-earth, from the humble hobbits to the elegant elves, are banding together to stop him. And now for a few notes on exposition in speculative fiction. That rhymed. Anyway, exposition in this particular genre is extra challenging because not only do you have to explain the characters and the situations, but you also have to explain the world and its rules. This is a huge balancing act. You have to learn how to give just enough detail without being overwhelming or confusing, which is why most speculative fiction writers utilize a technique called abeyance. I think that's how it's pronounced, wherein they give details such as names or terminology at the beginning of a story intending to explain what they mean later. This is a small mystery, and in particular for audiences that are not used to speculative fiction, it can be a bit confusing because they're used to having everything explained up front very quickly. Now, keep in mind, this is a huge investment of trust by your audience into you, the writer, because they're trusting you to explain what these terms mean later. You don't want to leave them hanging because they'll be fixated on what those things are supposed to mean. Now, let me give you an example of this from the beginning of Lord of the Rings. When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. A couple of questions comes to mind. Who's Bilbo Baggins? And why is he important? What is Bag End? Is it property? Is it a town? What is Hobbiton? Is it a country? Is it a city? And what do they mean by 11st birthday? That sounds like baby talk. But Tolkien, in his genius, explains things as he goes along. And finally, a few notes on literalism. Early on in speculative fiction stories, all statements are taken literally, which negates the use of metaphors. For example, in Card's book, he uses the term reptile bus, which for those who are not familiar with speculative fiction, they know what that is. It's just a really long bus. A really long commuter bus, if I remember right. But for those who are familiar with speculative fiction, they read that and their mind entertains all kinds of possibilities, including me. Which is like, is it a lizard that people ride like a bus? Is it a bus that looks like a lizard, moves like a lizard? Things like that. So there will be metaphors that you might use that for a mainstream audience, they'll know it's metaphors, but for a speculative fiction audience, they're going to take it literally, at least early on. Which is not to say that you can't use metaphors, but you should save them for later, once you have established the world and the rules of your world, so that way they know your audience says, what is a metaphor and what isn't. And on a related note, I highly recommend, this is one of my pet peeves, honestly, is that you avoid using analogies that take readers out of the NuLu of your story. For example, say you're writing a story that has a barbarian, and you say that he has shoulders as big as bowling balls. Okay, unless this world has bowling balls in it, or you have a narrator that is familiar with bowling balls, that's gonna it isn't gonna fit. It does not fit in that world. So try to avoid doing that as much as possible. Well, there you have it, true believers. All the major techniques for world building and story construction in speculative fiction. Now you know, and knowing is half the battle. G.I. Joe! Actually, that's not too far from the truth. Just knowing how to write speculative fiction is only part of what you need to know. Now you need to know what types of speculative fiction stories that there are. So not only that you can focus your writing, but also be able to market your story once you're finished. So come back for parts 3 and 4, while I will be discussing the major subgenres of fantasy and science fiction. Until then, please leave me comments, as I would love to get feedback from you about all the things that I've been talking about in this video and in part 1. Let me know if there are any story constructions that I may have left out, or any techniques that you would like to let me know about that I might be able to bring up in a future video. Until then, thank you for joining me this week on But I Digress. This is Nate Marchand, signing off.